The man who called himself Caleb came west not for gold, nor for glory, but for the silence of the land. He had paid for it with every last coin earned in a life he wished to forget, a life measured in gunpowder and regret. The deed in his pocket felt thin and brittle, a paltry receipt for a man's soul, but the 160 acres it promised were vast and empty. The homestead he purchased lay before him, a wounded animal crouched against the unforgiving plains. The cabin was little more than a collection of weary timbers, its windows like vacant eyes. The barn, larger and more imposing, sagged in the middle as if it had taken a fist to the spine. Red dust, the color of a drying wound, coated everything, stirred into lazy spirals by a wind that carried no scent of rain, only the dry rasp of forgotten things. This, he thought, was a place where a man could bury his past deep in the unplowed earth. A place to be forgotten. He sought not a new beginning, but a final, quiet end to the man he had been. He slid from his horse, the leather of the saddle groaning in the quiet, and walked toward the barn, his boots crunching on the parched ground. The great doors hung ajar, a dark maw gaping open. He pushed one, and it shrieked on corroded hinges, the sound an offense to the stillness he craved. A sliver of late afternoon sun pierced the gloom, illuminating a constellation of dust motes dancing in the stale air. And then he saw it. A shape, suspended. A human form, twisting ever so slightly on a thick rope slung over a central rafter. He saw the small, delicate feet, the dark, coarse fabric of the trousers, the slender frame. It was a girl, barely a woman, her head canted at an impossible angle. A soft, guttural sound, a hitching, desperate gasp for air, reached him across the space. She was alive. The silence he had paid a fortune for was shattered by the sound of a life being stolen. And in that moment, a question forms, not in his mind, but in the air itself, a question I now ask of you: when you have spent everything you have to find peace, what is the price you are willing to pay to protect another's life? Caleb did not hesitate. The soldier in him, the part he had tried to starve and suffocate with miles and whiskey, took over. It moved his legs before his mind could protest, his hand going not to the pistol at his hip but to the knife sheathed there. The blade, honed for utility and survival, slid free with a soft, metallic whisper. 3 long strides and he was beneath her, the awful creak of the rope filling the cavernous space of the barn. He didn't look at her face, not yet. To look was to connect, and connection was a complication he could not afford. He looked at the rope. Thick, hempen, cinched tight in a hangman's knot just below the rafter. He reached up, his fingers brushing against the splintered wood, and with a single, upward slash, he severed the cord. Her body fell, a dead weight he was only just prepared for. He caught her, staggering back a step, the surprising lack of substance to her a shock. She was all bone and desperation. He lowered her gently to the dusty floor, his knee sinking into the soft earth. Now, he allowed himself to look. She was Chinese, her face a mask of terror and oxygen-starved purple, her eyes wide and unseeing. A brutal red welt, a cruel necklace, encircled her throat. He laid 2 fingers against that bruised skin, searching for the faint, thrumming promise of a pulse. It was there. A frantic, terrified bird trapped in a cage of ribs. He worked quickly, his movements economical, honed by years of battlefield triage. He loosened the remnant of the noose, his touch gentle despite the calloused roughness of his hands. He tilted her head, clearing her airway, and watched, his breath held, as her chest hitched, then rose and fell in a shallow, ragged rhythm. She remained unconscious, a fragile doll discarded in the dust. He lifted her, her weight almost nothing in his arms, and carried her from the tomb of that barn into the dying light. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the clouds in a violent, blood-red hue, as if the sky itself was bearing witness to the atrocity. He carried her into the cabin, a place he had imagined as his solitary fortress, and laid her on the crude cot that was to be his bed. He had bought a piece of land to be alone, but the land had given him a person instead. The ghosts he was running from had a way of finding new bodies, new faces, new injustices that screamed for a response. He stood over her, a man caught between the past he was fleeing and a present he could not ignore, the silence he had craved now replaced by the terrible, fragile sound of another's breathing. The first days were a silent vigil. The girl, whose name he did not know, drifted between a fevered sleep and a state of vacant, waking terror. Caleb moved with a quiet purpose that belied the turmoil in his soul. He cleaned the welt on her neck with whiskey and a clean rag, his touch surprisingly steady. He boiled water and forced broth between her cracked lips, a few drops at a time. He sat in a rickety chair in the corner of the one-room cabin as she slept, his rifle across his lap, watching the shadows lengthen and listening to the wind howl its mournful song around the eaves. It was a familiar posture, the watchman, the guardian, and he hated it. He hated the way it fit him as comfortably as a well-worn coat. During the day, he worked. He threw himself into the Sisyphean task of taming the homestead, his muscles screaming in protest. He drew water from the half-dry well, the bucket coming up with more mud than liquid. He mended the section of fence that had collapsed, his hammer blows a stark, rhythmic punctuation in the oppressive silence. The physical exertion was a balm, a way to sweat out the poison of memory and the anxiety of his unwanted responsibility. He was a man who understood the language of action far better than the language of words. One afternoon, while clearing out the barn, the same barn that had been a place of execution, he found it. Tucked into a gap between two wall planks was a small, crudely carved wooden bird, its wings outstretched in a flight it would never take. It was smooth from handling, worn down by the touch of anxious fingers. He knew, with a certainty that needed no explanation, that it belonged to her. That evening, he walked into the cabin. She was awake, her dark eyes following his every move, her body tense like a rabbit's. He didn't speak. He simply walked to the cot, placed the small wooden bird on the blanket beside her hand, and retreated to his chair. For a long time, nothing happened. Then, he saw her fingers, thin and trembling, creep towards the carving. They closed around it, clutching it to her chest like a holy relic. Her eyes met his across the dim, lantern-lit room, and for the first time, he saw not just fear but a flicker of something else. A question. A fragile seed of trust. The silence between them remained, but its character had changed. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the unspoken weight of a shared, terrible secret and the nascent possibility of a shared future. The sound of hoofbeats came on the fifth day, a thunderous intrusion into their fragile world. Caleb was splitting wood, the axe a familiar weight in his hands, its rhythmic thud the only conversation he needed. He stopped mid-swing, head cocked, listening. It wasn't the plodding gait of a lone traveler. It was the confident, arrogant canter of multiple riders who knew the land and believed they owned it. He set the axe down and moved to the front of the cabin, his body a solid, unmoving silhouette in the doorway. He saw her face, a pale moon in the gloom of the cabin behind him, her eyes wide with a familiar terror. He gave a short, sharp nod, a silent command to stay hidden, and stepped out into the harsh sunlight. 3 men reined in their horses, kicking up a cloud of the ever-present red dust. The man in the lead was large, with a florid face and a cruel twist to his lips. His name was Gideon, and his presence felt like a stain on the landscape. "This is the Miller place," Gideon announced, his voice a gravelly sneer. He didn't ask it as a question. "It's my place now," Caleb replied, his tone flat, betraying nothing. Gideon laughed, a humorless bark. "Bought it, did you? From that yellow-bellied coward Miller? He didn't tell you about the livestock he left behind." Caleb's hand rested on the porch rail, inches from the worn grip of the pistol he had tucked into his belt. "Place was empty when I got here. Just me and the dust." Another of the men, a wiry rat-faced individual, spat a stream of tobacco juice near Caleb's boot. "Miller owed us. Left us his property as collateral. A piece of Chinese property. We've come to collect her." The words hung in the air, buzzing like flies over something rotten. Property. The casual cruelty of it settled like a stone in Caleb's gut. This was the source of the news, the reason for the terror in her eyes. Not a random act of violence, but a business transaction. A debt being called due. Caleb's eyes, the color of a winter sky, met Gideon's. He said nothing. His silence was his answer. It was a wall, a fortress, a declaration of war. Gideon's sneer tightened. "Look, friend," he said, his voice dropping into a false, menacing congeniality, "We don't want no trouble with you. Just give us the girl, and we'll be on our way. She ain't worth dying for, but what is a life worth? Is it measured in gold? In convenience? Or is its value infinite and absolute, a thing to be defended at any cost?" Caleb's silence stretched, becoming more powerful, more defiant, than any shout could ever be. He was a man who had bought this land for peace, but he was beginning to understand that true peace isn't the absence of conflict, but the presence of justice. And justice, on this parched and lawless piece of earth, had just been given a name and a face. The departure of Gideon and his men left a poisoned stillness in its wake. The threat was no longer a phantom from the past but a living, breathing entity that had promised to return. That night, the girl emerged from the cabin for the first time since her rescue. She approached Caleb as he sat by a small, crackling fire, the flames pushing back the immense, star-dusted darkness of the plains. She carried 2 bowls of a thin, savory stew he hadn't realized she'd been making from their meager rations. She handed one to him, her movements hesitant but deliberate. He took it, their fingers brushing for a fleeting instant. She sat across the fire from him, not close, but not hiding. "My," she said, her voice a rough whisper, raw from disuse and the trauma to her throat. It was the first word she had spoken. Caleb nodded slowly, acknowledging the gift of her name. "Caleb," he replied, the sound of his own name feeling strange on his tongue. The stew was hot, and it warmed him from the inside out. They ate in their customary silence, but it was a new kind of silence, one of partnership, not of distance. The next morning, a shift had occurred. When Caleb went to the well, Mai followed. She watched him haul up the muddy, gritty water, then walked a dozen paces to the east, her bare feet seeming to read the contours of the earth. She pointed to a spot where the dry grass grew just a little bit thicker. "Here," she said. Just that one word. Trusting her instinct, Caleb began to dig. Hours later, his shovel struck not rock, but damp, dark soil. By midday, they had found a new source, the water that filled the bucket cleaner and colder than any he had yet drawn. She had a wisdom of the earth that he, for all his strength, lacked. She began tending to the small, neglected garden plot behind the cabin, her hands coaxing life from the tired soil. She found wild herbs growing along the dry creek bed and used them to season their food. They began to work as a unit, a silent, efficient team. He would mend the structures, his strength rebuilding the bones of the farm, while she tended to the living things, her quiet care coaxing a pulse back into its heart. They were 2 broken people, a haunted veteran and a brutalized outcast, finding a strange and unexpected solace in the shared act of creation. They were not just mending fences and tilling soil, they were rebuilding a world. A world with just 2 inhabitants, a tiny island of order and hope against a vast ocean of chaos. The narrator in me watches them and sees the most profound of truths taking root, that a home is not for walls and a roof, but the safe space 2 people build in the shelter of each other's presence. The days that followed were a quiet storm of preparation. The unspoken knowledge of Gideon's return hung over the homestead, a constant, low hum of dread. But fear, they both seemed to understand, was a luxury. Survival was a task. Caleb spent an afternoon meticulously cleaning his old Colt Peacemaker. He disassembled it on a clean cloth on the cabin's small table, each piece of metal familiar in his hands. He pulled the mechanism, feeling the satisfyingly smooth click and slide as he put it back together. This was a ritual he knew well, a communion with the violence he had tried to leave behind. He was no longer just a farmer, he was a sentry. The ghosts of his past were no longer specters to be outrun but allies to be summoned. He then went to the barn and retrieved the length of rope he had cut Mai down with. The noose end was still tied in its hateful knot. For a moment, he considered burning it, erasing the physical reminder of that day's horror. But waste was another luxury they could not afford. Instead, with a grim determination, he unraveled the hangman's knot, his fingers patiently working the coarse fibers until the rope was just a rope again. An object of cruelty, stripped of its power, repurposed. He used it to rig a simple but effective alarm, a tripwire of sorts, connected to a set of old tin cans near the cabin, a silent guardian that would give them a precious few seconds of warning. "What do you do with the instruments of your pain?" Do you destroy them, bury them, pretend they never existed? Or do you find a way to transform them, to turn the very thing that was meant to break you into a tool for your own defense? While Caleb prepared for a fight, Mai prepared for a siege. She gathered edible roots, dried strips of meat, and filled every available container with fresh water from the new well. Her work was a quiet, determined testament to her will to live. One afternoon, Caleb saw her by the grindstone, sharpening the edge of a heavy garden spade until it glinted in the sun. Her movements were steady, her face a mask of concentration. The gentle soul who coaxed life from the soil was also a survivor who would defend that life with a ferocity born of desperation. They were no longer just a man and a girl, they were a garrison of two. The enforcers returned as the sun was setting, just as Caleb knew they would. They came not with the arrogance of their first visit, but with the skulking purpose of predators. The sky, as if sensing the impending violence, was a canvas of bruised purples and angry, bleeding reds. The world held its breath. The first warning was not sight or sound, but the sudden, frantic rattling of the tin cans Caleb had strung near the barn. The alarm. In the cabin, Mai's head snapped up, her eyes locking with Caleb's. There was no panic in her gaze, only a cold, hard resolve. He gave her a single, sharp nod and moved to his position by the window, the heavy colt feeling like a natural extension of his arm. The three riders emerged from the dusk, dismounting with a tense, coiled energy. "We gave you your chance, farmer." Gideon's voice sliced through the twilight. "The easy way is over." They advanced on the cabin, fanning out, their pistols drawn. The air grew thick, heavy with the metallic tang of imminent violence. A floorboard creaked inside the cabin. One of Gideon's men, the rat-faced one, fired a speculative shot at the sound. The bullet splintered the wooden wall, missing Caleb by inches, the report of the gun a deafening crack that shattered the last vestiges of peace. And so it begins. The age-old, ugly dance. What is it in men that makes them believe they can own another human being? That a debt can be paid with a life? The battle that unfolded was not a thing of glory. It was a desperate, grunting, terrifying struggle for survival. Caleb fired back, not wildly, but with the cold precision of a man who knew the cost of every bullet. His shot found its mark in the shoulder of the third man, who screamed and fell back. One down. Gideon and the rat-faced man used the distraction to rush the cabin, kicking in the flimsy door. The small space erupted into chaos. A lantern was knocked over, plunging the room into a maelstrom of shadow and fleeting, demonic light. Caleb met Gideon's charge, the two men crashing against the far wall. His gun was knocked from his hand, skittering into a dark corner. It became a contest of fists and fury. Caleb was strong, but Gideon was a brute, fueled by greed and rage. The rat-faced man circled them, looking for an opening, a knife glittering in his hand. The fight was a blur of primal survival. Caleb, disarmed, fought with the brutal efficiency of a cornered wolf. He drove his elbow into Gideon's throat, gaining a precious second of space, but the larger man was relentless. He slammed Caleb against the rough-hewn table, the wood groaning under the impact. Dust and splinters filled the air. Outside, the wounded man was screaming. Inside, there was only the sound of grunts, the thud of fists on flesh, and the ragged, desperate sound of men trying to kill each other. Caleb saw the rat-faced man lunging, the knife arcing towards his ribs. He twisted, the blade slicing through his shirt and scoring a hot, burning line across his side. He roared, a sound of pure, untamed fury, and drove his head into the smaller man's face. There was a sickening crunch of cartilage, and the man fell back, momentarily stunned. But the opening had cost him. Gideon seized the advantage, his powerful hands closing around Caleb's throat, squeezing the life from him. Black spots danced in Caleb's vision. He clawed at Gideon's thick wrists, his lungs burning, the roar of blood pounding in his ears. He was losing. The strength that had served him on a dozen battlefields was failing him now, in this tiny, dark cabin, in defense of a life he hadn't even sought. He was going to die here, on this patch of dirt he had bought to find peace. And in that moment of despair, a shape moved in the flickering darkness. It was Mai. She held the garden spade, its sharpened edge gleaming in the faint light from the dying lantern. She was not a warrior. Her face was a mask of pure terror. But a deeper instinct, the feral will to protect the only kindness she had ever known, drove her forward. She did not scream. She did not hesitate. She swung the heavy tool with all the strength in her slender body, not like a sword, but like an axe, bringing the flat of the blade down on the back of Gideon's knee. The impact was sickening, a wet, snapping sound. Gideon screamed, a high, unmanly shriek of agony, his leg buckling beneath him. His grip on Caleb's throat vanished. Caleb gasped, filling his starving lungs with air, and scrambled for his fallen pistol. He found it just as the rat-faced man, recovered from the headbutt, charged again. Caleb didn't have time to aim. He fired from the floor, the muzzle flash a blinding sun in the darkness. The man crumpled. Gideon, trying to crawl for the door, his leg a useless ruin, looked up and saw Caleb standing over him, the pistol leveled at his head. The fight was over. The silence that fell in the aftermath was more profound than any that had come before. It was a heavy, ringing quiet, thick with the smell of gunpowder, sweat, and blood. Outside, the wounded enforcer had dragged himself to his horse and fled, leaving his companions to their fate. Caleb stood over Gideon, his chest heaving, the pistol still steady in his hand. Gideon whimpered, all the bluster and cruelty boiled away, leaving only a pathetic, broken man. Please, he sobbed. Caleb looked from Gideon's terrified face to Mai. She stood frozen, the spade still clutched in her hands, her knuckles white. Her eyes were wide, not with fear now, but with the shock of her own capacity for violence. He saw the tremor in her hands. He had seen that look before, in the eyes of young soldiers after their first kill. He made a decision. He lowered the pistol. Get out, he rasped, his voice raw. Take him with you, he added, gesturing with the gun barrel to the unmoving form of the rat-faced man. And never come back. It took Gideon an agonizingly long time to haul his compatriot out of the cabin and drape him over a horse. Caleb and Mai watched in silence from the doorway as he limped away into the vast, indifferent darkness of the prairie. When he was gone, they turned back into the cabin, into the wreckage of their home. The door was broken, the table splintered, the floor stained. Without a word, they began to set it right. Mai found a cloth and began to wipe the blood from the floor. Caleb picked up the overturned lantern and, with a steady hand, relit the wick. A warm, gentle light filled the small space again, pushing the violent shadows back into the corners. He saw the deep gash on his side, the blood soaking his shirt. Mai saw it too. She came to him with a bowl of water and the same clean rag she had used on her own wounds days earlier. She cleaned his injury with a focused tenderness, her touch gentle. Their roles were reversed. He had saved her body, she had just saved his life. When she was done, they sat at the splintered table, the relit lantern between them, and shared a piece of dry bread, their first meal in their reclaimed home. No words were needed. In the crucible of violence, a bond had been forged, stronger than steel. They were no longer a man and a girl. They were a family. Months passed. The seasons turned. The harsh, windswept winter gave way to a tentative spring, and the land, as if rewarding their tenacity, began to heal. The rains came, soft and steady, washing the red dust from the air and sinking deep into the thirsty soil. The new well provided an endless supply of clean, cold water. The garden Mai had so carefully tended exploded with life. Green shoots of corn and beans pushed their way towards the sun, a vibrant, defiant green against the muted brown of the plains. Caleb, with Mai's help, rebuilt the sagging barn, its new timbers straight and strong. He repurposed the wood from the broken front door to make a small, sturdy table where they could share their meals. The homestead was no longer a wounded animal, it was a place of quiet, determined life. The rope that had once been a noose now served to haul fresh water from the well. The spade that had been a weapon in Mai's hands was now used to turn the rich earth of her garden. The symbols of their trauma had been transformed, through shared work and mutual trust, into tools of their new life. They still rarely spoke, but their silence was now a comfortable language of its own. It was in the way he would leave a wildflower on the table for her in the morning, and the way she would have a hot cup of coffee waiting for him when he came in from the fields. It was in the shared glance across the dinner table, a look that acknowledged everything they had survived and everything they were building, together. Caleb found that the ghosts that had chased him west had grown quiet. Their whispers were drowned out not by the vast emptiness he had sought, but by the gentle, rhythmic sounds of a working farm, the lowing of the milk cow he had bought, the contented clucking of chickens, the soft sound of my humming a forgotten melody as she worked. He had come here seeking an ending, a place to bury his past. Instead, he had found a beginning. He had discovered that peace was not an absence of struggle, but the act of building something worthwhile in a harsh world. And that home wasn't a plot of land you bought with coin, but a sanctuary you built with another human soul. So I leave you with this thought. We often believe our greatest strengths are forged in the fires we choose for ourselves, the battles we march towards with flags held high. But perhaps our truest character, our most profound redemption, is found in the unexpected fights, in the defense of a stranger, in the quiet, thankless work of mending a broken thing we did not break. What defines a family? Is it blood, or is it the shared courage to face the darkness together? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of courage and unlikely bonds moved you, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who needs to be reminded that even in the harshest ground, something beautiful can grow.